Howdy, this is another class from the BYU Library Family History Center, and it's on the 10 most annoying habits of FamilySearch family tree users. And I'm going to move through this and kind of get some little bit of idea of what's going on here. First of all, as I show on the first slide, some of these images are generated by AI. Some are better than others. They're just sort of generic in times, and so I use them because they're faster and I'm not copyright protected, and so I don't have to worry about somebody else claiming that I violated their copyright. And the first thing we need to remember is that the FamilySearch.org family tree is a shared tree. Now, what does that mean? It means that everybody on the tree can see everybody else. It's just, as I say here, like working in a crowded mall. Everything you can see everything everybody else does. Obviously, there is a private part of the family tree, and that's living people. But dead people don't have privacy rights. And so basically everything that goes on that we have in the family tree is open to everybody. And that creates a tremendous advantage for the family tree. The advantage is that we can quickly see what everyone else is doing, and we don't have to redo their work. It solves the repetition problem very, very quickly. But on the other hand, it creates its own issues, and that's what I'm going to kind of talk about a little bit today. Kind of another observation. The family tree is both old and new. It has more than 100 years of content growth. It's not something that just suddenly came out of existence a few years ago. The information that's in the tree, meaning the genealogical research that has gone into the content on the family tree, dates back more than 100 years. And so when you see something in the family tree that you perhaps don't agree with, or you think your information is more accurate than what's in the family tree, then pretty much you've got to think about the fact that there's been 100 years of people looking at this information, and some of them are extraordinarily, or were and are extraordinarily good genealogists. And it's very unlikely that they've made a mistake that you would be able to detect. And that's kind of it's not the fact that there aren't new places to add information. People come to the tree all the time that have no background. No one's ever looked at their family before, and they have an open field to do everything they want to do as far as adding information. But if you're coming to the tree and finding that there's a lot of work already been done and you're back in the 1700s, then you might just want to wonder a little bit about this. Now, it's either, I also say it's as young as the newest born baby. That's because the new information is going in all the time. There's always new information. And then there's another aspect to it. The family tree is both complex and simple at the same time. It's pretty simple to put in information, but what we're talking about here is genealogy, which is a part of history. And history is complex. And the people who are being entered into the family tree are complex human beings. And so we have to be kind of aware of the fact that their lives may not have been as simple as a date and a place and a time. So remembering that we're talking about real people who lived years ago, perhaps, and we need to be able to kind of extend our understanding as genealogists to understand what were their limitations? What were the things that they had to put up with? Where were they when these things happened and all of the things happened in their lives? So this is kind of the information that we're looking for. And there's another thing. The family tree, although it looks like it's extreme, it's kind of user friendly in the way that you can kind of get in and start doing things quickly. But there are some rules of the road. And we have the equivalent of speeders, red light runners, impaired drivers, and many other analogies when we start talking about how the family tree operates. So we have to understand that not everybody on the family tree is observing the speed limit and trying to keep everything under control. And this is my disclaimer. So there aren't any kind of blowback here saying that I'm ranking on the tree or whatever. The thing of this is that these are user habits that I'm going to be talking about. They're things that the users do. It's not the program. It's not the family tree itself. The family tree program works very well overall. It's just what the users do or don't do that comes to the point of being annoying. And I'm using the term annoying in the sense that there are things that I have to correct if other people do. So I spend time that undoing issues or redoing issues that are things in the family tree that other people have entered or put in there. So we're going to start with number one, and they're not in any particular order. They're just as I could think of them and remember that they were there. And they kind of develop. When I do one of these presentations, I start at the beginning, obviously, with an idea, and then it develops. And as it develops, it may not be linear. It may be kind of eclectic. But here's the first one. The first one here is this. This is kind of an obvious problem, and that is that people add information to the family tree, add names and dates and places. They don't tell us any sources. They don't give us any copies of anything. In this case, it would be a parish register for a parish. We would think that the name of the parish was Latin Essex, England, and that it happened on 15 February 1735. And there is kind of you'll see here that there is kind of a correlation between the annoying things that I see happening and these early dates of the 1700s. And the reason for that is that as you go back in time, it becomes exponentially more difficult to make sure that your records are correct and that you aren't just copying names out of the registers, the records, or out of books for that matter. And that isn't doing genealogy. That's not doing the research. So if you see zero sources, you basically don't know if this person lived, if it's the right person, or was the name just made up? If somebody just make up a name and stick it in there, put on date and something, thought that was a good way to do it. I mean, technically that's possible. If you put in the information, there's no automatic check to see if that information is correct. It's somebody like me who comes along and determines that that isn't the right person and isn't somebody that is related, and that their christening date is either not accurate or it's not the same, it's a different person. So this is kind of so we have a date and a place, but where did it come from? Where did we get this information? Why don't we have a copy or a reference to the parish register that the priest put this information into in England? And that would solve the problem rather quickly. Then there is a one-to-one relationship between the historical record and this person. And if the person's name has been accurately transcribed from the record, then we have a valid record. Now, it may not be the right person. It may be somebody with the same name. There's lots of other things we'll get to and as we go along here. But the lack of a source is nothing more or less than fantasy. So if you go back on any line if you have any longer lines, I'm saying some of you may be having only a very small amount of information on your part of the family tree, and you haven't really connected to anyone yet. And that's fine. And maybe everything there is totally verifiable and totally right. But if you are one of the very vast majority of users now, as the family tree has grown to have more than 1 billion people and many more than 1 billion people, you're very likely to connect with somebody and some line that goes back. And if you check each of the entries on the pedigree as it goes back in time, you can almost count on it that eventually you'll hit one that one or two or more that have no sources. And so if you're just checking to see if there's how accurate it is, the information from the standpoint of the thing with the family tree, that's the first threshold thing. If someone puts a name in there with no source, it might as well be a blank space as far as I'm concerned. I have to do all the research from the beginning, from the connection of that person into the family tree to determine if that person's name is there correctly or not. So it isn't really helpful. It isn't really establish anything that is useful to the greater idea of the family tree as a communal kind of organism out there. Now we have another thing. I mean, we can use it's the nature of these issues that we can use. Sometimes I can use the same person for multiple of the annoying things that I find. And we're here at number 2, and it's failure to standardize dates and places. A very simple process. All you have to do is edit the date and click on the little pencil, edit the date, and click right behind the last digit. And then the standardized date will appear. Click on the standardized date. You've updated it. It takes 2 seconds to standardize a date on FamilySearch. And we'll get to that. The same with the places. Now, the places are more complicated, and I'll get more into places right now. But standardizing helps because that tells you might have something that's not correct. So here's what we're talking about, is this part right here, and the date and the place. And here's the reason. The reason is that standardized dates and places, also known as standards, enhance the accuracy of the information you enter. They also improve the searchability of the data, making it easier for you and others to find and use. So it makes it easier. You're actually, when you begin working in the FamilySearch family tree, you're moving into working with a very, very, very sophisticated computer program. And it knows that your information has not been entered correctly, and it will put up little red markers telling you it's wrong. So, because I do this constantly, I simply standardize everything every time I look at an entry, whether it's one of my entries or not. And that makes it so that it does, so that we get more standardization. Here's another example. This is the same problem. This is related level of annoying. It's not enough to get into a new number, but it's very interesting here. And it's this problem right here. This presentation is being done on the Sunday before the 4th of July. And I think that if you think about the 4th of July, it's called Independence Day. And I think if you go a little further, you might know that it's associated with something called 1776. And so why is the United States being used as a place in 1710? When it didn't exist, it wasn't really even an idea back then, kind of if anybody thought about it, it wasn't something that was going to happen very soon. And so the question is, was Virginia in the United States? And the answer is no. And so why do we have the United States there? Well, it's because, and I'm going to acknowledge another issue. And the other issue is that there's some people who have, over the years, developed this concept that they want to put their places in the places they are now so that they can find the records. And the answer is exactly the opposite. We put the places as they were at the time of the event because that's how we find the records. We have to know where the record was created and what all of the jurisdictions were at that time in order to find more historical records. Okay, so this is that's why it's kind of annoying things. So the other part of this particular entry that I've taken here is annoying because of putting alternative names in the name field. And what I mean by that is this. This is either that was her name or the other one was her name. But the general rule here is that the name is as it appears on the earliest source record. So what we have here is there whatever the name was on the earliest source record, if there were any source records, which there probably aren't any source records, but if there were source records, then we would take the earliest name. But in any event, if it came up as variations of the name, we would take the earliest one we could find, and the other ones would go into the other information category on FamilySearch. And the name would be just Jean Savril, rather than putting Jane in there with parentheses that messes up any searching on by the computer. If you're wondering why you're not getting any record matches or record hints, because you've been putting all this kind of stuff in your name category, extraneous information, then that's the reason. And if you just put your names in as the earliest source record shows, then if that's a birth record, it's fine. If it's a death record, that's fine. In other words, but it's the earliest one, and then you have the best chance of connecting that to other records that have been created for this person. Okay, so now we're getting into a little bit higher and more, let's call them a little more esoteric type of annoyances here, but are the kinds of thing that we really need to understand. This entry is not only going to have number 3, but it's also number 4 and number 5. And the fourth issue is giving an about date when there are no sources showing why that date is reasonable. Okay, so when I do this, you'll see. And if you see what it says birth, 0 sources. That means nobody knows when this person was born, but we're going to put in a date anyway. Now, if you're, old school genealogist working on paper, there was a way to estimate birth, death, and marriage records dates from just generally what was accepted in those years. So basically, it's something you can just kind of guess at. So it's possible to put in an about date, especially if there's lots of records that show this person's living at a certain point in time, and then you can say that person was probably 20 years old when this happened, or the census record says it's 20 years old, and you don't have any other birth records, so that you can go back 20 years and say this person was married about 20 years ago because that's what's in the U.S. Census record. What we're talking about right here is no sources. This date was just made up out of the thin air. Okay. So what else are we concerned about here? We're talking about number 5 also, which is the place. And we're going to get into this now in a little bit more detail so we can understand. Adding an imaginary place to an imaginary date. Unless you happen to do the research, unless you happen to have the knowledge of the time frames of various things. When were the first colonies in Virginia? They're in 1600s, by the way. It's Jamestown. And I'm going to not try to do that out of my head, but it's about 1604. And so that's kind of the back end of what we've got. But when were these counties and towns started? What is Shepherdstown and Berkeley? That's supposed to be a county and it's supposed to be a town. Was Shepherdstown and Berkeley in existence in 1674? Ask that question every time you see something like this. Okay. And of course, there's a discussion back and forth about using British colonial America as it's never been a real designation of a place, but it's something that's kind of grown over the years to be used. So it's a little bit, but we're not going to do anything about it. Okay, but there were no sources listed, but the place did not exist at the time of the imaginary date. Okay, if you do just all you have to do is take Shepherdstown, put it into Google, and say date of establishment. And as soon as you do that, you'll get a date here, 1762. Not only is it off, it's off 100 years. And that makes a tremendous difference, because if this was established in 1762, what was there at 1674, almost 100 years earlier? Just think about it. Who was there? Who got there? Yeah. And how did this woman get out there and have a baby out there in that wilderness with all the Native Americans running around? Okay. Is that a good thing to think about? Well, what about Berkeley County? So let's try to look at Berkeley County. So Berkeley County is founded on May 15th, 1772. Now it's another 100 years before. So neither Shepherdstown or Berkeley County existed in the 1600s. In fact, they didn't exist in the early 1700s. So where were these people born? And when were they born? And how far back can you carry this? By the way, this particular line, I've just been waiting for somebody in the family to correct it. Other than me, it is my family, but because I need these extra. This is so obvious errors that I need them to use for occasionally for examples. These users didn't take the slightest steps to determine if the information was even reasonable or correct, and they just stuck in some names and stuck in some places. So, do we even know if we have the right people? We don't even know that. And this is another one. Okay, so we've gotten to 6. So we're out of my one that is just so obvious that it hurts, is number 6, and that's adding a middle or other name when no sources have the person with a middle name. I don't know where you think that's possible or even right. This is a very well-known person, by the way, in the world of history. And he's been known as John Hamilton Morgan for a long time. But when you go back into the records, there isn't one record, no record during his lifetime that recorded him with a middle name. So where did the middle name come from? Actually, someone made it up and stuck it in there. And it got copied and copied and copied. And pretty soon It was everybody knew that he had a middle name. The interesting thing about this is the Morgan name. And that's what we're going to get into a little bit next. But just so you have some idea about middle names. Now, middle names have an interesting history in English. We're talking mostly in English here, although there are other countries that have extensive naming patterns. And you need to know the naming pattern of each of the countries that you're going to be dealing with, because when you look at a record, you need to know if that's your person, and you need to know the pattern of that. So if it's a name in Spanish or German or French or Hungarian or whatever it's in, you've got to know that that name is reasonably it's reasonably, and that you haven't left off the parts that you want to keep. Spanish names, for an example, can be extraordinarily long. They can have as many as 10 or 12 different names attached. So there's there is a possibility that their name might be extraordinarily long. But in the other case, in English and early years of English, use of middle names has been not such a common thing. And it was only the elite people in the community who wanted to show their importance by having a middle name and some titles after their name. In the United States, 90% of the population have middle names, but they're not universal. And for instance, I've seen people transcribe a middle name, and in the Army, what the US Army would do is write no NMN. So your name would be like this one, John Morgan, NMN. And then they would have the last name. When they transcribed it, that's the way they transcribe it as the person's name. The acronym there from the Army is no middle name. So that's kind of what you need to be aware of, is a little bit more of this in the naming patterns. So this is something that you can discuss back and forth and take some research on and learn about, and then it makes you more aware of whether or not the name is correct. And we have in my particular family lines, in the first 6 generations, I have 2 individuals, 2 direct great someplace great back grandfathers who did not have any middle names during their lifetime, but were added after their deaths, and they're almost impossible to get rid of. If I take it out, someone will think that I've done it wrong and put it back in. But of course, they didn't do all the research through all the records to see if they actually had a record that showed his middle name. Now, I did find, when I did this, I wanted to check again. So I went out and I did the research on John Morgan to see if there was one of the documents that I had that had a middle name. And I did find it, but it happened and it was put in after his death. So that's the interesting thing about it.
James, someone's asking about, you had a record prior that had Sergeant Major before the given first name. So what is your opinion on things like Captain and
Fine.
Sergeant Major General?
Yeah, they're fine. There's a place, FamilySearch has a title for, when you look at the form for entering names in English. And by the way, there's a way of looking at entry for names in English and in a lot of other languages. There's another little click in FamilySearch right above on the left-hand side of the name entry field, which I can't show here right now. But if you click on that, you can get a list of all the countries for all of the different name patterns that they've put into the FamilySearch family tree. But the English names have a title. So you can put Doctor, Sergeant Major, but if you put it in the name pattern, I mean, if you put it in the name field instead of in the title field, then that's a problem.
That's my point, that there's a place for it, but probably in the name, the searchable name, it's just going to complicate the search.
Yeah, no, yeah. the guy probably wasn't a sergeant major when he was born. So
No.
putting a name in as it is when the earliest record, if you have a birth record, it's not going to have sergeant major on it. So sergeant major is going to become an alternative name or a title, which is a possible under the pull down menu for the other information on FamilySearch. There are titles. So we take care of all this stuff. FamilySearch has all that ability without having the entries themselves messed up.
What would you say about junior and senior after the name?
Well, there is a place for suffixes too, so they can go in there. You just have to bear in mind that junior does not mean that the person was related to someone named senior. That junior meant, in most cases, the younger person in the same town who had the same name. So assuming that they're related simply because there's a junior and a senior designation is not a correct thing. That's not a correct assumption, and that may be completely wrong. So you just put it connected to people who aren't in fact related. So now we're to something that's a little more complicated, and I would have liked to have done some animations and things here, but I didn't want to drag this out. And here we have to do with something that is kind of annoying as the seventh one is failure to look at the sources. And then number 8 is ignoring the distance involved in the early 1700s. But it's kind of everywhere. And it's something that you need to be aware of in every case. But when you get back before that magic 1700 date and you're into the 1700s and the 1600s, you have to remember, and there have been big studies that have shown that people did not move around. They were born, they got married, and they died within a relatively small area. Sometimes they say 6 miles, sometimes 10 miles, sometimes 15 miles. But anything over that in the 1700s becomes highly questionable. And you really need to dig in and do some research on who these people were and why they would have traveled those distances. And so it's very important. Now, this is a simple way to do it. You go into Google Maps and you put in the places as if you were driving to that place. So you go in and you put in Brotherton, for example, and then you say, I want to drive to Croston, directions to Croston, and it'll give you the directions. It'll tell you how long it takes to drive there and how far it is. And then you could say, I want to drive to Bolton, and then it'll add that. See, now you have 3 names that may be, and I just took these names out of some records that we'll look at here in a moment. The question is the events that occurred in Brotherton likely to have happened if there were similar events in Bolton? In other words, could a person be married in Brotherton and have a baby in Bolton? Could a person have been born in Brotherton and died in Bolton? Okay, those are the questions we ask. And granted, it's more of what you might call a more advanced kind of problems, but it's not helpful if you just disregard this. And the reason is because it's almost inevitable that you will find people with the same or similar name in the same area. And the only way you can separate these people out is by very carefully examining the places on every single record that you can find about these people. And you should be doing as many records as possible. And why the 1700s? Because there aren't that many records. And so it makes it extremely more difficult to say, nah, this person is not in the same family. Because you could say, well, maybe they could have traveled that far, and maybe they did. And why don't find anybody else with that name, and that kind of thing. And so you really have to be aware of time, the places and the types of transportation that were available. I picked 1700 because the Industrial Revolution in England began in 1830 with the advent of the first railroad, commercial railroad. In other words, there were railed ways of transporting goods before 1830, but there had to be they had to go one more step and begin using it for transportation for people. And that began about 1830 in England. So 1700 means they were stuck not with a car that would take 1 hour and 26 minutes, but if it was 43 miles, it would be at least 2 or 3 day trip on foot. And even if you had a horse, which probably they did not have, being they were my ancestors and they're all poor as church mice, is that they are never going to do it. They're just not going to walk that far. And then preparations you would have to do, and there's no place to stay. So you just have to lay down on the ground and go to sleep and stop at night because there were no inns and things that were convenient. And even if there were, the people that I'm dealing with here, as I knew, didn't have enough money to do that. So they wouldn't have traveled. And so their chances are they married somebody in the same area, had the same area for all their kids, and that was the end of the story. Okay, so let's look at it here in some kind of detail so you can understand a little more what I'm saying. So over here on the left-hand side, I have Thomas Ellison, and I have when he was born, and that's in Altham in Lancashire. And then I have him dying, whoever put this in, dying in Rivington, Lancashire. Okay. Now, you might note that there are names here, screen names of people who have entered this information. Everybody knows, in other words, your login name is going to show up on all your entries. So you just need to be aware that's when we say this is a communal tree, it means that. It means everybody sees everybody else. Okay. And so the question is, how far is it from Alton to Rivington? And it turns out it's about 23 miles. Is Rivington a bigger place or a smaller place? The way the world works is that people move from smaller places to bigger places to get more job opportunities. So there's a real question here because this is 23 miles. And we may very well have picked up the second person by the name of Thomas on a parish register in the 1780s for a death record. And another thing is, where did they get a death record in 1780 in England? Because the parish registers didn't record death dates, they recorded the date the person was buried. And the second part of that is that even the death dates weren't recorded until the civil registration began around the 1850s. So here we go with some dates here that are some problems. So now we'll look at it a little bit more and we'll see some other issues here with the same thing. So we're going to look at some more places that are coming up. And these places all come up and you can see that they're all over the place. We have different places here. You need to do the research in each one of these places. If you just pick up a name and it's in Bolton, you need to go see how many people with that name were in Bolton at the time. And it's possible to do that. You can do the search on FamilySearch. You can also, for Bolton, for the same name and see if there's any other people in that area that come up in the records. You can do it on a program called Find My Past. Very simply, just add the name and it'll tell you how many people there are in that place with that name. It gives that automatically. So there's ways to do this. And so why this is annoying is because they didn't do the research. They didn't have anything that showed that they had actually gone through this process to make sure that the names of all these people are the same. So basically I'm going to have to go back through if I want to do that and I want to work on this particular line. I would be going back through and establishing with all the records that I could find this actual family and make it so that it actually worked. And then there's a complicated problem of when you look at, and this is the important thing in this one is this next number that I mentioned is that you need to look at all the sources, to then read them through and understand what your sources are before you start adding information to a family. So here's Thomas Ellison, 1720 to 1780, 80, and I refer to them by the last three characters of their ID number. He's 88X. And you look down below, and there's Thomas Ellison again. It's 88X, the same person. They have married to a wife in 1723 named Ellison, and has two children, one in 39 and one in 42, which is another question. Oh, they got married in 38. Okay, that's right. So they're married in 38 in Rivington. And then you go down below to the Thomas Ellison and Ruth. Okay. And we have different children, not the same children, but different children born in 46, 48, and 53. So here's the question. Did he have two wives, one whose name was Ellison, not likely the same name, and another one that's called Ruth? Well, okay, but let's look at the two people, Ruth and Ellison, side by side. Ruth is born about 1723. 1724, and Ellison is born about 1723. This happens to be a surname. It's possible that she married somebody with the same surname, but that's not impossible, but it's very unlikely because there's strict rules about marrying your relatives in England and other places. So here's got two different births, 1723 and 24. One's in Bolton, one's in Bretherton. We've got different children. We haven't looked at where the children are all born, but that might add some more complication to the whole problem. And so what are we going to do? Well, we look at the resources. Now we have the sources of a child who is named Ellison, and the father's name is Thomas Ellison, and the mother's name is Ruth Ellison. Now we know Ruth's, so we don't know which one this is. It's in 42, and there's a Peter Ellison born in 1742. So this might be Peter Ellison, but down below that might be, there's no marriage event, so we don't know. So are we working with two different families with two different sets of children? We're working with a family with the same children. And we have some problems here because now we have an event place in Croston, and we have to see how far that is from Rivington and see if we're doing this. In other words, this is complicated. It's not something that you can superficially look at and say, oh, this is right, and do this, and put them all right in order. If you do that, then you become one of those annoying people for me, because I have to come through here and I see that there's all these contradictions and all these difficulties and all these things. Immediately, it doesn't take me like 10 seconds to know it. I mean, it's not something, it's something you learn over the time as you're working with it, but you can very soon tell that there's some kind of problem here. And so basically, what are we going to do with this? Well, let's look at the places. There's Bolton, there's Bretherton, and there's Croston. Bretherton and Croston are coped together, but Bolton is not. Bolton's 43 miles away. That's not. So the Bolton issue, if I go back quickly here, we have one in Bolton and one in Bretherton. Okay. And so now we're looking at Bretherton and Bolton, and we're saying maybe the Croston one, but not the Bolton one. Okay. But we don't know which Thomas we're looking at. Okay. There we go. So, summarize. It is possible but unlikely that Thomas Ellison married someone with the same surname. And the only source is a baptism record for possibly a child, in which case the name Ellison is correct. But the mother's name on the attached source is Ruth. So we have it wrongly listed, and it was right on one of the sources that's already attached to these people. So somebody didn't even bother to look at the sources when they entered the information in. Okay, so that's why it's annoying. And it also illustrates the first rule of genealogy is when the baby was born, the mother was there, and that's self-explanatory. And that lady could not have been in two different places and married the same person and still had babies. We're getting close here now. The number 9 is a family line that forgets to end. Okay, so now we're going to look back at if you remember just kind of briefly here, we talked about the Sergeant Major Richard Morgan, and we also talked about Jane Jane Cheverell, and we thought that that was kind of unusual. Well, guess what? As Sergeant Major's father, Edward Morgan, got married in Shepherdstown, Jefferson. We've already looked it up. We've already looked it up. We know that Shepherdstown wasn't there in 1675. Why is it showing up in another record under Edward Morgan? And it's in a different county. And now it's in West Virginia. I mean, there are some facts that help your life measurably doing research in the United States and in England and in every other country. And they're called important events. And an important event in the United States for West Virginia is when was it created in 1862? During the Civil War. Not there. Okay. And if I'm wrong in the date on West Virginia, sorry, but it was during the Civil War. So these people are imaginary. This whole line is an imaginary line. And we have the next one born in Maryland. The parents are in Maryland. They get married in Maryland. How are they going to get to Virginia from Maryland in 1640? How are they going to get down there? How are their children going to get there by 1675? You need to understand that there were no roads. There was no transportation. There was nothing. In 1776, and that during the time of the Declaration of Independence and the drafting of the U.S. Constitution, which took place primarily in Annapolis, Maryland, at the State House, Thomas Jefferson, who lived a few miles away in Virginia, had to get to the State House for the meetings of the Constitutional Convention and all was going on. It took him 2 weeks to travel with his wagon from his house to Annapolis. So try looking at it up on the map and seeing what you think about the distance. And then you can begin to understand why this makes absolutely no sense. And the fact that they're jumping from her over to England is very interesting too. Okay, so those ends of family lines. So what do you do with these? Now, what if you find out that this last Richard Morgan is not even the right, but you go back another one, a more recent, and you finally find one that's correct, but all the rest of them are wrong? Do you just cut them off and let them float away into the outer space of the family tree? And the answer is you need to think about that. And instead of doing something like that, what you would correctly do is to replace them systematically with the right people if it's possible. If it's not possible, it may be necessary at some point to say we don't have a parent for this person, and any of the other stuff that was added is just imaginary. And all I can say about this line is that it's a lot of gibberish. So this Morgan line goes back to 1130 in Wales. Of course, none of these support each other as being parents and child, but the first one has no sources. And then from the sources, he was born both in Wales and in Virginia. And then William Morgan, the next one in line, was supposedly born in England, but has no sources showing any children. So where did all this information come from? Now we're to number 10. Number 10 is the absolute most annoying habit of the family tree. I saved it for last, and I'm not going to say a whole lot about it. All I'm going to say is that here's the prime example. This is Richard Warren. Who is Richard Warren? He was a Mayflower passenger. How much information do we have on Richard Warren? We have a tremendous amount of information about Richard Warren, and it's all published and generally available. There is no question about the correctness, the accuracy of his information. There's nothing that can possibly be changed without going through a tremendous detailed examination and some real research done on site in England. And they haven't been able to do that for this person for the last over 100 years of time that they've spent looking for him and his ancestors. We don't know who he was, but we do know some basic things about his life, and we do know that there are some things that we don't know, and they're all published. And this changes every single day. I put this in today, so you would see every one of those changes was done yesterday. That's how often this changes. They keep adding and changing and adding. His burial can't change. He's buried in the same place. No one's moved him. His death can't change. We know the date of death. It can't change. But here they are, day after day, changing the information. And people are changing it back. Okay. So these are the good guys and the bad guys on here, by the way. So we don't want to create any problem. So this person's information changes almost every day. And there are people out there. I call these revolving door ancestors. And this is absolutely the most annoying thing about the family tree. And it creates some very bad publicity. So if we could just get people to stop changing information that they don't know is completely accurate, that they haven't looked at. What they have to look at is the historical records from the Mayflower descendants. And that's in the Mayflower families through 5 generations. And here's part 3 of the book for Richard Warren. And there's 2 more parts. And that's all the information there is about Richard Warren and his five generations of his descendants. And if there's anything to be added to it, you can go try to get the Mayflower Society to agree with you. Okay, so this is the summary. Too fast. To repeat, FamilySearch.org Family Tree is an excellent website. It's great. The annoying habits are not a reflection on the website. They're all user issues. If you need help learning about how to use the FamilySearch Family Tree, I suggest you get started with some basics on the Family History Guide, thefhguide.com. Thanks for watching.
James,
Yep.
there was a question. So I'm searching in a foreign country where they took on the name of the farm they moved to. Where do I note that so that I can continue to seek out the correct person if I'm entering only in the earliest known name for them?
Well, you enter the name, but you can put that in the notes, which are a very good place to put it and explain that in detail. Or you can put it into the alternative name and explain that it's a farm name when you do that. And that's not uncommon. And people who are working in Scandinavia would understand that quickly, or should.